universidad corporativizada, un tema muy interesante. Profesor Ahrens, no me presenté, pues, my name is Mary Veracolina, de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia, miembro de la red QRCA. Nice to have you here, Professor Ahrens. Thanks on behalf of our network for being with us. Also, Professor Ver, you will be introduced later for your speech, but now you have your time now. I pass the microphone to you. And remember that we have some interpretation options for our audience. Our audience could be connected or listening to you in English, Spanish, or Portuguese. So welcome and thank you again for joining us. So Professor Ahrens, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the kind invitation. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you. I'm very honored. And I'll try and share my screen, which is here. Okay, so that should hopefully work. If I press Alt, nothing happens. Let's see if I can move this away. Now it's gone. Wonderful. So yes, and this should also be smaller if I can. Yeah, great. So my screen is working also now. I hope you can also see me. Please interrupt me if there's anything wrong. The talk today is entitled Academic Freedom in the Context of the Corporatized University. And it is one that is based on some research I have been undertaking for the last year and a half or so, together with Jan Pfister, who is working at Turku University in Finland. Why talk about academic freedom and how did we get to this topic? I mean, one good reason is that academic freedom has been under attack, mainly from governments that want to cut funding for universities, but of course without losing the benefits as they see them, mainly economic benefits of having those universities. The way in which they go about this is they were removing the older professional bureaucracy form in which the university was run by academics as colleagues on the principles of professional ethics. So the idea was that these academics would pursue knowledge and truth and education in a self-directed manner, guided by a collegial administration, and they would take turns at being administrators. The corporatized university is very different. It has replaced the collegial administration with full-time managers on the principle of efficiency. So the task now is to extract more and better research from given inputs, where the inputs are the academics, to extract more and better teaching from them, to use the surplus to invest in better inputs and train or remove the underperforming academics, and then to manage the cost of inputs through casual or part-time academic labor. And now in many countries, the share of part-timers is indeed very high amongst the academic labor force. The corporatized university, of course, developed in the context of expanded higher education, when universities assumed the organizational form. It is perhaps difficult to remember that universities used to be not formal organizations in many ways, with line managers and annual targets and strategies and mission statements, but instead they were sort of clubs of people who were teaching and researching things, and didn't invest heavily in formal organization. But now these newly formed entities compete in many ways, in rankings, in endowments, in awards, patents, publications, etc. And many of them pay great attention to rankings, not only for business schools, like the Financial Times ranking, but also for university rankings. Now, you might ask yourself then, okay, this may be as it may, but how does this broad context relate to our daily work as scholars? What difference can we make? How does it influence what we do? And of course, one important consequence is that quantifiable output of universities becomes much, much more important. Yves Gendron has written a very nice paper about this called Constituting the Academic Performer, the Spectre of Superficiality and Stagnation in Academia, from the European Accounting Review. He says that demands for accountability and performativity translate into tendencies to favor research strategies that produce visible and reliable knowledge at regular and short intervals. This, he says, threatens to reduce intellectual diversity, and also the drive for performativity strengthens the appeal of conformity and contributes to production of superficiality throughout academia. In other words, if the objective of the research is no longer the content of the new knowledge, but instead the form of output that can fit into the ranking schemes, then we need to have content that is predictably publishable. And for that, it should be conform. It should not stray too far off what we know already, so it should not be too innovative. This, he says, is a problem. If you want to read the fiction version of this, there's a wonderful novel called Changing Places by David Lodge. And in this novel, you have two protagonists. One is the ruthlessly ambitious Morris Zapp, who works at Euphoric State University, which is a pseudonym for University of California, Berkeley. And he changes places with Philip Swallow, who is at Rummage University, which is another word for Birmingham. But you'll find out when you read the novel. And Morris Zapp's plan is to be the most highly paid literature professor in the world. And he plans to he is that already, I think. And he plans to secure his status by writing a multi-volume review or interpretation on the work of Jane Austen. So when he has finished his multi-volume work, he figures that everybody else will have nothing more to say because he will have said everything, and all the other departments can close. So he takes this idea of the performing academic to its very extreme. But you know, these are I think general reasons why we should be concerned with academic freedom and the current state of universities. It's something that I've sort of known about for a long time, but it's not something that I've worked on particularly. And it wasn't until I was invited to give a talk on paper development by a group of colleagues in Northern Europe who wanted to have an audience of sort of doctoral students and postdoctoral students spoken to about paper development. Now, I thought at the time that I knew something about paper development because I had written various papers and helped edit and review others. But when I looked into it, it turns out that paper development for most people who write about it or give seminars doesn't mean develop the paper so that it says exactly what the author wants to say, but instead they seem to think that paper development is the way in which you can shape your research in such a way that it becomes most easily accepted by the journal. So in other words, the author should bend over backwards so that the reviewers would find the work not offensive and interesting enough so that it might be published. And so the message that I thought we should have, how can we help authors develop the message that they want to send to the audience, was not so important in the sources that I found. Now, this talk has turned later into a paper, and the reference is there below. It's in Qualitative Research in Accounting and Management. One of the organizers of the workshop was Jan, on the right side there. And Jan Pfister and I got talking, and because Jan's concern was what responsibilities do authors have for their writing. So he too didn't think that you should just try to publish anything and be happy with it. But he said, you know, if you have published something and you think it's right, you should also be concerned about whether this is going to have a good or a bad effect later on. So there should be a concern with how people pick up your work and then sort of work with it. Of course, this is something that we were thinking about in a sort of Northern European context. But if you look to France, the answer is clear. You shouldn't do this. The French sort of philosophers and French thinkers are of the view that one should not worry about what happens to the text once the text has been published. Nevertheless, we think it matters what we study, how we study it, and how we report it. And it also matters to what effects our writings give rise. Now, in Jan's case, there was a particular paper he had published in the Accounting Review together with Kari Lukka, and it was about a company that did extremely well and got very, very great productivity gains year on year by putting extreme pressure on the employees. Now, for this company, this worked, and the employees were psychologically very unusual. So that was fine for them. But what if what is reported in this paper in a prestigious journal becomes normalized? What if people say, oh, so this is how we should do it. Maybe we should try this in our company as well. Shouldn't the researcher consider how the work should be interpreted by the readers? And don't the researchers have responsibility, because they don't just record somehow automatically what's real, but instead they record very selectively, and then they think things through concepts, and they produce a very particular take on reality. There are chats. What do they say? Oh, okay. They just say hello. That's excellent. Good. Carry on. Very good. So in this talk, therefore, I want to reflect on academic freedom, what it is, what we should do with it, by combining ideas on what good and responsible research is, and also at the same time give you a sense of this research project that I'm conducting still with Jan on good and responsible research and how this itself developed over time. So let's start by saying, what is academic freedom? I have two answers. One is a preliminary one based on Max Weber's ideas. The other one, a more comprehensive one based on the work of Axel Honneth, a German sociologist. Well, they're both German sociologists. Only one of them is dead. So Max Weber gave a famous lecture in 1917 in Munich. The First World War was still going strong. And he talked about to a youngish audience, people who might consider studying or being academics, about reflexive freedom to follow one's inner calling, hence the idea of vocation, to follow one's inner calling to discover truth and create knowledge. Now, Weber was very, very passionate about this point. Weber himself, if I recall correctly, had 2 PhDs, worked extremely hard, had several nervous breakdowns, just from overwork probably. And so this is how he describes it. He says, without this strange intoxication, which appears faintly ridiculous to outsiders, to non-academics, without this passion and without this feeling that thousands of years had to elapse before you, the academic, entered life, and more thousands of years are silently waiting to see whether or not your conjecture, your hypothesis will be confirmed, one has no vocation for science and should do something different. Nothing has any value for anyone as a human being that he cannot do with passion. And Weber certainly was extremely passionate about science. So the key values that he is here talking about are truth, logic, then sticking to a method, and of course the possibility for reputation, without which the work isn't really scientific. Weber also recognized, of course, outer constraint. He was not an idealist. He knew what was going on. Disciplines define what is and is not worth knowing. Science is about control of nature. Medicine is about prolonging life. Other disciplines have their values for what is worth knowing. The important point is that as sciences, they cannot determine that those values are in fact meaningful. In fact, when we gave a similar version of this talk at a different university, one of the comments was, well, you talk about control of nature as a value. We see where that got us in the current state of the environment or in the way in which animals are treated. So these values are taken for granted as meaningful by the academy. And these disciplinary values are what is worth knowing at a sort of second level of value. Yeah, so the first value would be, or the first level would be truth, knowledge, method, refutability. The second level would be, okay, we are about control of nature, we are about prolonging life, and so on. All of these are, of course, hierarchically organized, and all aspects of academia are hierarchical. The department is, the university is, funding arrangements are, the journals, how the journals operate, how the journals relate to each other, which journal is on top, which journal is not, etc., etc. Weber was pessimistic about the spirit of academia. He said, the large institutes of medicine or the natural science are state capitalist enterprises. Remember, this was in 1917. Their administration would not be possible without extremely generous resources. The result is the same as it is wherever capitalist business operates, the separation of the worker from the means of production. So we can't do craft work, but we have to have employees. The worker, in this case the assistant, is dependent on the means of labor that are provided by the state. Consequently, he is just as dependent on the director of the institute as a factory worker is on his employer. The institute director in all good faith regards this institute as his institute and holds sway there, and the assistant's situation is often as precarious as any proletarian type of existence, or that of an assistant in an American university. If you get a chance to read his lecture, he has very interesting views on American universities compared to German universities at the time. Key points of the modernization of academia, according to Weber, is that it is a capitalist university bureaucracy. It has ministerial influence, too much ministerial influence for his taste. Careerist researchers with mediocre minds get promoted. In fact, he says that promotion is mainly due to chance. Popular star researchers with questionable knowledge content are loved by the students and therefore hold much sway in the university. There's too much emphasis on short-sighted usefulness and not enough emphasis on what is actually true or what is fundamental and foundational to the disciplines. And here are the third level of values. Personal life values, for example, political convictions, seep into the academic world. And often if these life values seep into the work and instead of doing research, professors talk about the things that they like best, then the researcher can become a salvation prophet or a political leader or something else that is unconnected and is not befitting in Weber's view of a professor. Weber was then in many ways prescient. Many of his points are echoed in today's NPM discussion about universities. Nobody even mentions the importance of passion in the way that Weber did, or having fun in the process of knowledge creation. And Weber's concerns about making the university bureaucratic, capitalistic, and efficient is today visible in the focus on general notions of performance and performance management systems. Again, I remind you of Yves Gendron's argument in Constituting the Academic Performer. So Weber says, what should we do? How should we live? And he's quoting Tolstoy here. How should we? Yves Gendron hopes for points of resistance. He thinks that if we explain the performative model better, it may be better understood and resistance can form. One of the things that I like best about Yves' paper is how he explains that the idea of the academic performer is not just a negative idea. It's not just something to be resisted, because the academic performer is also Yves. So he criticizes the academic performer idea, but he knows that when he is invited to evaluate someone else's promotion, or when he is invited to judge which grant application should receive the funding, what does he do if it is not in his discipline? He goes and finds out some statistics. How many papers published? In what kind of journals? Top-tier journals, not so good journals? How often published? Single-authored, co-authored? How many citations? Blah, blah, blah. We have entire sort of banks of performance measures that we can use. And so the academic performer, the idea of performing in academia is sustained not only by the university bureaucracy that wants to make the university more efficient and squeeze more output out of the university, it is used by the academics themselves, because the academics are two-faced. On the one hand, they say, I want funding and promotion decisions that are based on fair, comparable assessments and not some idiosyncratic commentary by some luminary professor. But then they say at the same time, I want my work to be appreciated on its own terms, on its specific insights, and on the manner in which I create these insights. I don't just want to be a number or a statistic. So here we have a problem. Weber's answer is, stick to your vocation, bury yourself in the disciplinary puzzles that arouse your passion, be passionate to know more. Fight for what is worth knowing by knowing more. And don't be distracted by the mediocre minds who get promoted without any reasons and their undeserved careers. Just show them what good academic work really is. But I'm afraid Weber's answer is too simple because it goes full circle. What really is the good work that is worthy of academic freedom, that is worthy of promotion, of tenure, and so on? So we need some way of being able to agree what's good. One thing that Jan and I were thinking about is whether we can solve this problem by looking at the different paradigms. Maybe the idea of good work is different for positivists and different for interpretivists and different for critical theorists. But then we thought, well, that really just delays the problem. We're kicking the can down the road by saying, let's solve the problem later and let's solve it in a smaller kind of way for smaller groups. So instead we said, let's make it more complex. Why don't we connect our two questions? How to write good research with the question, what is responsible research? And we try to do this with the resource of a new scholar. Well, he's quite old, but new to us, Axel Honneth, whose book we are trying to use to see what is the freedom, what is the academic freedom, how can we think about freedom and good research together? Okay, so if we have a broader question of freedom, then what is that freedom that can produce good research? And this would be related to Honneth's book. So Honneth, in his book, draws on three conceptions of freedom, he says, each of which builds on different assumptions about the socio-ontological preconditions of individual freedom. So he wants to look deeper into how freedom actually works and what kinds of freedom there are. He distinguishes three. Negative freedom, or freedom from, is opposed to external constraints. Okay. Reflexive freedom is about self-determination and self-realization. So it's about autonomy, but also about authenticity, where somebody can develop out of themselves what it is that they want to do. And the last one is social freedom, which is grounded in mutual recognition and intersubjective experience. Now, I want to talk about all three of them, but really about the third one, because that's the one that certainly for Jan and me was the most interesting and surprising, where, you know, you read it first and you think, that's not freedom. What is he talking about? And it took us a while to sort of let it sink in and think, aha, if that's freedom, then what can that tell us about academic freedom and how we can contribute as a group to academic freedom, even though we are in usually corporate universities? So here's a long quote from Axel Honneth. What he says is that social freedom is related to how subjects must have learned both to articulate their own aims to the other and to understand the other's articulations in order to recognize each other as interdependent. This is, of course, very different from negative freedom. Negative freedom just says no constraints. And your objectives can be irrational. They can be very egotistical. Okay. You don't even have control over your own aims. They're just somehow there and you act on them. Okay. Now here we have something else. We have articulation of the own aims, which you also have in reflexive freedom. But Honneth goes further and he says, no. Here you have to be able to articulate your own aims, but also do it in relation to other people's articulations. And he draws in his work on Hegel. Hegel believes that such reciprocal comprehensibility is ensured by the institutions of recognition. And by that he means bundles of behavioral norms that objectively integrate individuals' aims. So in other words, there have to be norms, there have to be learned behaviors that help make sure that you have your antenna out for how other people want things to happen, and you have skills to connect that to your own aims. But moreover, there are norms that say these are good skills. This is what you should have. You should be watching out for what other people want, and you should be trying to connect this. And here comes the bold sentence. They ensure that subjects can recognize in the behavior of their alter ego, the other people, the desires whose fulfillment represent the condition for the fulfillment of their own. So in the fulfillment of other people's desires, can their own be fulfilled? Because the individuals striving for freedom can thus be fulfilled only within or with the aid of institutions. The intersubjective concept of freedom expands once again into a social concept of freedom. So he labels the bundles of behavioral norms, he labels them as institutions. He's got a similar, which just follows. He sort of goes round and round a bit. He has sort of meandering paragraphs, but he tries to make the same point several times. He goes on, a subject is only free if it encounters another subject within the framework of institutional practices to whom it is joined in a relationship of mutual recognition. Only then can it regard the aims of the other as the condition for the realization of its own aims. So he basically says the same thing, emphasizing the importance of the institutional nature of those behavioral norms that focus on understanding and responding to other people's aims. To be with oneself in the other thus necessarily entails a relation to social institutions, for only established and routine practices can guarantee that subjects will recognize each other as the other of their self. And only this form of recognition can enable individuals to implement and realize their reflexively determined aims at all. Okay, so we'll come back to that, that idea. How does this matter to the existing debates of academic freedom? Well, academic freedom is often implicitly construed as negative freedom or freedom from. When you read the literature on new public management and academics complaining how they get performance measured and how their academic freedom is curtailed, it is often with this in mind. Yeah, don't constrain us, let me do what I want. Freedom from constraints focuses entirely on the external liberation of action. It excludes, notions of self-determination, because freedom of individuals does not include the selection of aims. Aims are left up to the play of causal forces, as Axel Honneth puts it. Within the concept of negative freedom, motives are not subjected to rational judgment, and they can be egotistical. Reflexive freedom, by contrast, holds that following mere desire is not freedom. You would be a slave to impulse and a slave to vices. You would basically be more like an animal in the view of philosophers such as Immanuel Kant. To inquire into one's intention and will shows a potentially universal principle because, following Kant, subjects can only obey principles. They also want everybody else to obey. So what you don't want for yourself, you should not want for others. The principle of universality also conveys attitude of universal respect, because others can never be treated as a means only. They can only ever be treated as ends in themselves. So this is Kant's idea of moral autonomy and self-determination. We don't need this now. Notice here the active nature of social freedom, the emphasis on the mutuality of freedom, certainly in Kant's, but also in more strongly in Honneth's version of freedom, is not about having freedom, but doing it. So we could talk about having academic freedom rather than, sorry, we should not talk about having academic freedom, but instead think about how we can do academic freedom, which goes back to one of the introductory slides where I had the group of academics saying, okay, but what are we supposed to do about this? So by seeking out the aims of the other as the condition of the realization of my own aims, I would have a strong collaborative element. Personally, I find this formulation too sort of cerebral, too intention heavy, because we're talking about practices here, and practices follow much more naturally, and they're much more intuitive, and they're much more sort of in the world than, you know, thinking about what are your intentions, what are my intentions. So I think something like this happens already in academic practices that create knowledge, even in the condition of the corporate university. The question is how? So academia as institutionally grounded activity and practice, I think works something like this. What is this? Strange. I don't know why there's a green line on the screen, but maybe that's just my screen. Academic knowledge, if it is academic knowledge, is always new in relation to the literature. So you always argue what your contribution, what your addition is. And it also is always refutable, because you say, here's my methodology. If you disagree with my methodology, you can refute my claims. It is always, therefore, institutionally grounded in the literature, in methodology, and in peer review, however they are adequate for your discipline. And to function for knowledge production, these institutional groundings must exist interactively, intersubjectively, and objectively. They are there in various ways in the discussion in academia. They must also be continually questioned, updated, and revised in dynamic academic practices. The moment we stop updating our methodologies, we know that our discipline is in trouble. New knowledge is thus by definition that which interests other academics. So the idea of mutuality is already built in the moment you start to write your paper, because you have to think, what is the literature? What did other people think? How can I talk to them? How do I convince them of my claim? And so you need knowledge is that what is defensible and further expandable by others. Because when you write something, you want others to work with it. In fact, this is one of Weber's key points about being an academic. When you find new knowledge, of course, you are passionate about it, but you know it's going to be refuted at some point. Somebody is going to come up with something better. And so there is this, in the discipline, there is a notion of progressing along the objectives of the discipline, whether it is more control of nature or whether it is more prolongation of life. Whether that makes sense, whether you should have people who are 150 years old, is a different question, and it is not a question for medicine. So in that sense, science and academia are limited. Academic freedom is therefore a condition in which academic practices can interest and enroll academics into knowledge projects based on the first and second level values of Weber. The first one was truth, knowledge, logic, methodology, refutation. And the second one were the disciplinary life sort of level values. So they would be, science is about control of nature and medicine is about prolonging life. But this is general. More concretely, how can we enhance academic freedom? So one thing to look at would be collaborative practices around co-authorship. Something that struck both Jan and me is how we were able to collaborate with journals that not normally publish the kind of qualitative work that we like to do. So I published something with Chris in Contemporary Accounting Research, Chris Chapman that is, in 2004, and Jan published something with Kari Luca in 2019 in the Accounting Review. And these were untypical publication outlets for interpretive studies. There were many commentators involved before we even submitted the journals. Because once you think about it, you think, well, you know, it's not like you send a paper to a journal that normally deals with interpretive work. So you need to think about, what are my reasons here? Who do I want to talk to? How do I want to talk to them? Do I write my normal style, or do I say, no, wait, I need to make adjustments if I want to read, if I want to reach people who normally read papers that are written differently? Okay, you need help from the editors, in this case, Steve for CAR and Michael for TAR. You need the support of the reviewers. In Jan's case, what was particularly interesting with the accounting review was that one of the two reviewers throughout the review process said, no, this should be rejected. I don't think it's actually the right journal. It's not right. It's not ready. It's not good enough. However, this reviewer also said, hey, I'm all for dialogue and information and sort of knowledge exchange. I would change your paper like this, this, and this, because you need to answer these questions. You need to be ready to speak to people in these ways. You need to address that bit of the literature. So this reviewer kept pushing and giving good sort of ideas and arguments to make the paper better. And that was very, very beneficial for the paper. Until in the end, the editor could say, oh, that looks really good. It's ready for the accounting review. And so your personal view of, you know, I think it should be rejected is one thing. The important thing, however, is how do you engage in this mutual relationship? What kind of an academia are we working for? And in this case, if I want to have my papers reviewed professionally and supportively, I should do the same, even if I think that this particular paper isn't ready for publication. And so this required adaptation to the target audience, you know, different writing styles, thinking about how to relate it to future research opportunities. And so for us, this were sort of important events that helped us understand what is it that you can achieve through mutual recognition. But of course, at the time when we were doing this work, we didn't use this phrase because we hadn't read the book by Axel Honneth yet. More generally, we could talk about editorial practices that can help and support mutuality. So, for example, the role of the editor and reviewer should not be about themselves, but it should be about the other. It should be about the author who comes along with a manuscript and says, hey, what about this? I think this is a good idea. So the reviewer should be a pluralist who accepts many ideas, not an imperialist who wants to make his or her empire bigger. And they would ask, you know, what review would I want to read, and act appropriately. Theoretical and conceptual openness would be important, also from researchers outside your subdiscipline. So you would ask yourself, how can I learn more about this new idea? What's the potential for my own work? How would my own work add to the perspective that is being advanced in this journal submission? As an editor, you should ask yourself, when does the paper cross the threshold of newsworthy? When is it, you know, interesting stuff that people should read? It doesn't matter whether the reviewers are still thinking that stuff needs to be done. Okay, they can be detailed, but the editor should have a big picture view and say, well, I think on the whole, this thing is ready. Yeah. So as an editor also, what can I do to foster mutual recognition in your editorial practice? Now, more specifically, in the introduction, it was mentioned that I'm an editor of Qualitative Research in Accounting and Management, together with Lukas Goretsky in QRAM. So we think about how can we have more mutuality. So we happen to notice that the Audit Society, one of the influential books in accounting and beyond, you know, in other disciplines, people quote and work with the Audit Society, has its anniversary now, 25 years, the Audit Society, still going strong. Lots of citations, lots of ideas. And so we invited a number of colleagues to write short pieces about their work with, their encounter of the Audit Society, which is an interesting sort of reflection. And we think it's sort of quite thought-provoking and stimulating, and hopefully the readers will think the same. We are open to suggestions for special issues. Just an hour ago, actually, I was dealing with this really an hour ago. We posted the call for the digitalization in management, accounting, and control special issue that was suggested by a group of colleagues. And we said, yeah, this sounds really good. People want to talk about this. We need to make space for it. We encountered a strange paper, an unusual paper that was published in AOS in 2019 by Hendrik Vollmer. Sort of unusual to read, kind of slightly unsettling in a way, but full of sort of promise and ideas and sort of big claims about how accounting theory should change. So we organized a seminar of this. We talked to Hendrik and he came along online, and 3 comments were prepared by 3 colleagues. And this will then become very soon a special section or a special issue in QRAM. And then we got a very interesting submission from South America, where a junior academic was writing about sort of some aspect of experience of gaining knowledge. And we thought, wow, this is sort of interesting, but what is it? It's not a research note. It's not a fully fledged research paper. We can't make it an editorial, so we invented a new category for this kind of idea. So we invented qualitative insights. And qualitative insights are original peer-reviewed research developed from junior or senior scholars' reflections on the qualitative research process or on individual elements of this process. So they can be based on the author's own experience, but are supposed to advance broader conversations. So you see here the mutuality, yeah? We want to have things where people have thought-provoking ideas that speak to what's sort of in the air, what people think about, what is people's concern. And this could be relating to qualitative methods or methodologies, or it could be related to accounting academe, or it could be related to the role of scholars in contemporary society, and it should be relatively short, 4,000 to 6,000 words. So that would be peer-reviewed, and that could be published. And we've had, we have some submissions for this now on track. People have found it interesting, and it's a different kind of making the journal not just the place, not just like a warehouse, where, I've done my work, here's the paper, whoops, there it goes, forget it, now on to my next project. But I think it would be nice if the journal had more of a sense of a place where you can sort of keep talking and you can keep arguing about things. So we want to make the journal more respectful to the communication wishes of authors and readers within the boundaries of academic writing, but they're dynamic, like I said earlier. I'm sure that there are many journals that would look at this qualitative insights and they would say, hey, that's not a paper. You can't put that into a journal. But, if it is about academic discussions, then Lucas and I think, yes, you can. And we'll show. And we'll see if it flies, or maybe it won't. We don't know. But we think it's worthy of an experiment. Now, that's all very nice, you might think to yourself, but let's really be serious here. In the context of the corporate university, do you really think there's going to be mutual recognition with, university management or with funding agencies? Are we not just, controlled by them? So how realistic is this vision of a social academic freedom? For example, we hear a lot about individual academics getting fired. Nobody says, you, Professor X, have to go, but instead people make little groupings and they say, well, we can split the biology department into this part of biology and that part of biology. And then we can say, oh, looks like for this part of biology, there are not so many students. We should reduce them. And then you fire these people, okay? You can make that happen if you are the president of the university. At Leicester University in England, we recently saw that critical accounting researchers were targeted quite openly. Then we know that lots of academics are casual or part-time work. And we also know that universities have special entrepreneurship units that are there to make money, make profit, but they are not there to increase knowledge. And clearly, these facts are indicative of a lack of mutuality in the academic labor market. And I think that institutionally, the academic labor market needs to change because it's highly individualized. So my personal view is that we need academic unions, labor unions that are actually effective, but also that are working with academics and not doing what they have been doing for a long time. But that's sort of a different paper. But at the same time, as we have these very worrying aspects of corporate universities, I think there's nothing to stop us from fostering institutions of sort of mutuality and social academic freedom that can, in a way, overlay the corporate university. Yeah, so there are aspects to do with your labor contract. How writing for an audience, whether that audience is academics, or it could be social workers, or it could be all sorts of other people that are consuming your work or engaged with your work in some way. So implications in the context of the university new public management. The disciplinary and hierarchical practices that also Max Weber was aware of should be used to create academic social freedom in support of the other. And I gave some examples from editorship and reviewship. One could extend this, for example, to doctoral training that could work much better. And in many cases is oriented towards mutuality. Honneth says that when individuals grow up with institutions in which normative practices of reciprocity are permanently established, then in Hegel's view, they will learn in the course of their upbringing or Bildung to develop desires and goals that can only be satisfied through the complementarity actions of others. And I think he's right. And I think you can see this in doctoral students who have been educated in this way. I can certainly see it in sort of my own understanding of my doctoral studies, which were very much about reciprocity, and sort of learning the value of commentary, feedback, and discussion. Because subjects cannot become aware of their mutual dependency without such institutions, the latter are at once the basis and the space of realization for this kind of freedom. And I think without this kind of freedom, it would be very hard to do anything about the corporate university. So in conclusion, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to shift the view from a negative and reflexive academic freedom to a notion of social academic freedom, from the lone scholar to an intersubjective mutual view of scholarship, to let the variety of roles that scholars play, not only as authors, but also as commentators, as reviewers, editors, promotion committee members, and so on, benefit from mutual recognition. So to keep the focus on the other very firmly to the fore. To then raise awareness of scholars' responsibility in normalizing certain behaviors and their implications. So it's important, we think, that reciprocal behavior and mutuality become normal, so that people who enter the system experience this as normal and then also learn how it is that you act in this way. And in that way, we hope we can have sort of a complementary or an alternative to Yves Gendron's academic performer. We don't have a good word for it yet, because the supportive vocational scholar sounds a bit like a mouthful. But hopefully we find a sort of shorter, better label. Thank you very much for your attention.
Pueden aplaudir otra vez. Gracias, Professor Ahrens. Thanks, Professor Ahrens. We have some minutes for the QA session, so wait a minute. Okay, I had to use 2 microphones. Okay, so I was just saying thank you to Professor Ahrens, estaba dando las gracias. And we have some minutes for the Q&A session, preguntas que puedan enviar. Pueden ver si alguien quiere preguntar aquí en la audiencia. Dani? Okay, in English or Spanish?
In English, yes.
Okay, Professor Ahrens, we think we can keep interacting in English just to ease your interpretation button, but then we have a question here in the room, so Professor Dani will be here. Creo que puedes subir para que él te vea. Sí, para que te vea en la cámara. So, que te presenta, sí. Hay que usar compartiendo.
Professor Thomas Ahrens, thank you very much for your insightful and provocative presentation. I'm Danny Garcia from University of Antioquia, and I have 2 questions. The first one is, would you agree that given this notion of the entrepreneurial university and the search for social academic freedom, is failure vanished from academia? I mean, I don't see any academic showing off by saying that her or his theory is a straw person, right? Nobody goes out there saying, I'm very happy because I found that my theory is completely wrong, or that the interpretation that I made about life or social science is wrong. So that would be my first question. My second question of curiosity is, could you maybe mention a little bit more, talk about the differences between the German and American universities that you mentioned that Weber explains a bit? Could you maybe talk about that a little bit more, and if those differences persist today? Once more, thank you very much for your great presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for those questions. They're very interesting. If I start with the first one, you know, has failure been eliminated from the system? My sense is that failure has, well, even before the system started, failure was not popular because academics aren't sort of made that way, and people don't like to admit that they got something fundamentally wrong, and at the same time, I think academics don't mind it if they get criticized heavily, because it makes them feel more important, and they have then plenty of opportunity for rebuttal and can sort of dig in deeper, you know, advancing their particular point of view. I think in a sense, failure gets redefined in the performative sort of entrepreneurial university, because failure is now non-output, and it's kind of worrying in that sense, because I remember when I had my first sabbatical at the London School of Economics, one of the professors said, "Hey, how's it going with your sabbatical?" And I said, "Oh, I had all these great plans, but it didn't work out. What I was planning to do doesn't actually work. It was a stupid idea, and now I'm doing something else." And he said, "Oh, great. Often the most productive times are the ones where you don't get anything done, but you just sort of think around something and you lay the groundworks and you become much more certain. And if we keep having to perform, then those sort of empty times aren't there. And I guess you have to paste them over with publishing something that isn't particularly interesting, while you really work on something else." Regarding the question about the Weber's view of American universities, at Weber's time and until now, the German universities are organized around the chair, the sort of Lehrstuhl, chair of the professor, and that means that the professor is not just one of the employees, but is an institution inside the institution with attached obligations to teach hundreds and hundreds of students, but also have budgets for assistants whose job it is to help with the teaching, because the loads can be really high, and the work of grading and so forth can also be very intense. So the professor there is sort of like a mini organization in itself, and very much master of his or her domain. And that hasn't changed all that much, as what I can see. I've never actually worked in Germany, but I speak much to German colleagues. Whereas in America, you have the much more bureaucratic form where the department is the organizational unit, and the professors are just more important employees in the same department. And then they don't automatically get assistants. They need to sort of earn them with research grants. And so the assistant in America would expect to get a PhD and get promoted, whereas the PhD or assistant in Germany is more of a servant who hopefully catches the favor of the professor and then can make a career for him or herself. I think that hopefully has changed since Weber's time, but I think the American model is still similar to what he described.
Thanks for your comments. I have a comment. I don't want to pose the question. Wait, but this is in Spanish. Is a comment, not a question to answer right now, but in terms of it's very difficult to have a hybrid session.
Te escuchamos bien, Mari. Te estamos escuchando bien.
Okay, so just a comment, and maybe we can have this question in the future for you as in your role as a editor of a journal. Greg is here also. Maybe he's going to talk about this in some minutes. But in terms of the vocabulary that you use in your presentation, in terms of mutuality, I will comment. I don't know how to say this in English, but how about mutuality in languages? Not only in considering papers from other regions, for example, Latin America and others, regions that are underrepresented in the academic literature, in accounting literature. How about mutuality in terms of languages? For example, think about in your editorial committee, submitting papers in other languages, maybe in Spanish, maybe in Portuguese. We have been working this kind of experience with other journals. So just an idea for you. You're combing your hair.
It's interesting.
but just a short comment, but it's an idea maybe for the future. So some crazy ideas, but I will frame this question or idea in terms of this mutuality.
I'd be kind of, I think language isn't the problem. It's the tradition that's the interesting bit. Because for example, if somebody writes a French paper and my French is really weak, if I just stick it into Google Translate, I get something that is close enough to what I want, and I can get the key points. But then, and so for me, the language isn't so much the issue. And as an editor, I can't say, hey, it's a multi-language journal suddenly. The publisher is going to fire me immediately. But what would be great is if we can have write the paper in Spanish, stick it into Google Translate, get a colleague to look it over and say, this is not how we really say it. It's more like this. And I think what you will find is you get a product that comes out of a tradition of thinking, which is new. There's Anglo-American scholarship. There are differences between the UK and America. On the European continent, I know there are very different traditions. I would expect that there are different traditions in South America, not one, but many. And those would come out if you get the publications from the country where you do not have the tradition of publishing, for example, in QRAM or in AAAJ or wherever it might be, but where you have national journals or international journals with a different group of participating countries or in a different language. And I think then we're going to get really interesting discussions.
Thanks for